Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. So we're going to be talking about how to calm teenage anxiety today. And we have Sophia Galano. She is a clinical social worker and has extensive experience working as a therapist in residential, inpatient, outpatient, and educational settings. She has provided educational talks to local high schools and it often serves as a consultant to other therapists, in addition to providing private practice therapy. She also is a master level Reiki practitioner, yoga instructor, expert consultant for Hollywood, Health, and Society, and volunteers for several animal rescue organizations. And her first book on adolescent anxiety has been released called Calming Teenage Anxiety. With that, let's welcome Sophia.
I'm very excited to be here. It's going to be a fun conversation.
Yes, I agree. I'm so excited. So we're going to be talking about teenage anxiety, which I think is a really hot topic right now. Is just so much anxiety is happening and we're all looking for answers as to why this is happening and really solutions, right? So we're so glad to have you here today to talk about this topic.
Oh, thank you. I'm very excited. I really appreciate you having me. I'm super passionate about this topic.
Yes. Okay. Amazing. Okay. So let's just jump in and talk about what do you think teenage anxiety looks like beyond the obvious signs? So we know our teen might say, I'm anxious, I'm worried, I'm stressed about this. What other things might we be looking for to identify that our teen is actually experiencing anxiety?
Yes. And it's a great question and particularly a great starting point. So a lot of times, people come to see me in my private practice with that exact question of, I think something's going on, but it's really hard for me to differentiate what's normal, quote unquote, normal sort of standard adolescent behavior versus what's concerning, and I go into detail in my book. So, I just wrote this book, Calming Teenage Anxiety, and there are very specific, concrete examples in there. But what I usually reference as kind of a starting point is, I give this example of, let's say, a student who is about to take a test, and say the student is feeling stressed, they're feeling nervous, they're feeling overwhelmed before the test, but they're able to sit and take the test. They're able to get through it. They're able to, attend their next classes. They're able to finish their assignments, attend their extracurriculars, continue socializing with their friends. Okay, that's kind of more of a, let's say standard teenage behavior. We're not going to want to overlook that entirely, completely disregard it. But that's something that, maybe we're just going to kind of take note of. Whereas, let's say the teenager that is so nervous before the test that they are refusing to go to school because of the test, or the teen that's having a full-on panic attack before the test, or throwing up before the test, or cannot complete their other assignments because they're so nervous about this test, or refuse to go and attend their extracurriculars because of this test, or even avoid kind of socialization because of the anxiety associated with the test. That's when we're going to want to take a closer look at what's really going on here. And I remind parents of this all the time, and this is heavily emphasized in my book, and I, repeat this over and over again, which is for parents to remember that teens are not expert communicators. So most teenagers are not going to sit down and say to their parents, I'm really struggling emotionally, and I could benefit from some additional coping skills and emotional regulation techniques. It's going to appear very different than how an adult would communicate.
Sure. Yeah. So what do you think, so first, before we moved on to this question, so I think something that I find in my practice that could be helpful for people is to name what they're experiencing as anxiety. Do you find that that's helpful for teens, for them to know, for a parent or an adult to say, what you're experiencing is anxiety, or this is what anxiety is what you're experiencing? Or do you think that that is unnecessary?
I do feel that it's helpful, and obviously what I, say now is a kind of a general overview, so I mentioned this in my book too, that, what I talk about is kind of more of a blueprint and more of an overview. And of course, it's not a one size fits all, so
Sure.
if, let's say there's a teen that, really finds that labels actually, they like the labels, but it actually prohibits them kind of moving forward in their life, or they sort of use it as, I don't know. I don't want to say a crutch or a way to kind of get their parents to enable them. That's going to be a different story. But generally speaking, I do find it very helpful, and I talk about this in my book too, which is that oftentimes I have adults in my practice that come and they describe their adolescence and they say, I never realized that I was struggling with anxiety. And I knew that's what was going on. And oftentimes for teens today, just knowing that there's a label for what they're experiencing can feel like an enormous relief for them. It can feel very validating.
Yeah, that they're not alone, right?
Yes,
And so
yes.
that isn't the solution to have the name of what the emotion is, but it is like a starting place to figure out like what tools do we need, or what do we need to move forward or go forward with this.
Yes, exactly. And it's important for parents, and goes back to that to recognize that it could be something deeper than just sort of the standard teen angst or standard behavior or due to hormonal changes or what have you, for parents to really take it seriously, and also to be very compassionate with themselves if, let's say, they've overlooked a teen's anxiety, because it is hard to recognize.
Yeah. Okay. So can you talk about, obviously teenage brain development is really complex, and a lot of things are happening in terms of wiring and pruning, like getting rid of things that we don't need anymore, and also developing new parts of our brain. So there's a lot of brain development, also body development happening during this time. So what do you think? Can you talk to us about like just the brain part of like what is happening in a teenager's brain that might be contributing to their anxiety?
Yes. So, I always say kind of two different approaches and two different angles, when parents ask me kind of what's contributing to a teen's anxiety. So always, to preface, I always remind people that, I'm not a medical doctor. However, it is important for us to note that a teen's brain is very much still developing, and studies shown that, oftentimes it isn't complete with its development until kind of the mid-20s. So for parents to really keep that in mind, that, there are these major biological components contributing to a teen's anxiety: the brain developing, hormonal changes, chemical changes, and oftentimes anxiety can be very physiological. So, and I mentioned this in my book too, kind of in the early chapters, how important it is for parents to check in with their teen's physician to make sure that there isn't, a medical issue contributing to that. As therapists, we kind of know that's one of the first things we have to do, before diagnosing someone is, we have to rule out any other medical conditions. And oftentimes, very well-meaning parents, understandably forget that that can be a component to this, and having said that, there are also these newer factors too, which again, I go into in significant depth in my book, on top of kind of these sort of classic causes contributing to anxiety that many parents experience in their own adolescence, like the biological factors, like the chemical changes, the brain still developing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I think maybe something that's helpful for parents to know is like there are changes in our brain where we go from being really close to our family, and it's not that we reject our family, but friends become a priority, and that's like a normal thing. But then, that can, when there is friendship troubles, that can cause a lot of stress, right? Whereas like maybe when they were younger, it was like, oh, Sarah didn't play with me on the playground, and I'm upset about that. But then they came home and they got to put a pause on that because that wasn't as important. Like it was an important relationship, but they also were prioritizing home life and that home balance, and also the other things that they did, the sports or the activities. And so then that kind of maybe held that issue until the next day. Whereas when you're a teen, you tend to have access to your friends, or if there's an argument, there's like conversation around that continually, it feels like. And then when that is dysregulated, that relationship with somebody important to you, also that can cause you a lot of distress. So understanding those things, that priorities are also changing,
Definitely.
And we're also, I think, in the teenage years, more apt to take risks, right? Because of the way our brain is kind of changing. And so like that can be something that parents are concerned about, or some kids, we want them to take risks, but they're not taking risks, right? So that can also sometimes be a concern, is like, not that we want to do things that are like dangerous, but it's like taking the risk to ask a girl out, or taking a risk to join a different team, or taking a risk to try out for a position on the band, or whatever it is, right? Like whatever your kid is interested in, that they're too afraid to take risks. Taking risk is also something normal that happens. And so expecting that. So do you think there are things about the brain changing that can make teens feel overwhelmed, like just in and of itself, like the hormonal changes and getting used to those changes, that they can, just like the average teen, can feel kind of overwhelmed?
Oh, yes, absolutely. 100%. And this is where, goes back to that, differentiating kind of what's the sort of standard teen, stress or standard teen behavior, knowing that all of this is going on and that these brain changes and hormonal changes, chemical changes are very real and are happening for, all adolescents. But then where do we differentiate? Okay, this is what's going on versus when is it time to take a closer look? And this is where it kind of goes back to the, mindful observation of a teen, of what extent they're struggling and also how often. So even with that example I brought forth earlier of the math test, or, a academic test, is if, let's say, a teenager is experiencing, kind of that level of stress to the point where they refuse to go to school, where they have a panic attack, they're throwing up, and let's say it happens once a year, again, are we going to disregard it? Absolutely not. Are we going to just exist? No. However, we are going to take a different approach to a teenager that, let's say, that happens to once a week, or multiple times a week, or even multiple times a month, or even once a month. We're going to want to look closer. And again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it is really important for parents to be compassionate with themselves if, let's say, they have confused this. So let's say they have brushed aside a teen's anxiety, saying, well, I know my teenager are going, I know they're going through some changes, and I didn't think it was anything serious. It is very, very natural and understandable for parents to confuse that. And that's a big part of my work with the teens when they come to see me in private practice, is also helping the teens understand that their parents are really doing the best they can, and how tricky this subject is, and oftentimes requires a bit of investigative work and kind of reading between the lines.
Yeah, totally. So how do you suggest that parents kind of engage those conversations? So like you're talking about, let's get some more data. How do we do that to understand, because our teen in that place, we might say like rate this, like if 0 is no anxiety and 10 is the most, they might rate it 10 every time. Or maybe they would say it's a 2, but really when we dig down, it's actually more, and it's causing more distress, or right. So how do we get to the information that we need as parents to support our kids?
Yes. And, also to preface here, again, as a reminder, this is a general statement. So of course, if there's an emergency situation, we're going to want to take a different approach. So, if, let's say, a teen is suicidal or engaging in self-harm, severe substance use, we're going to want to take immediate action. But generally speaking, what I recommend is for parents to, again, lean on that really kind of mindful observational stance, where they want to engage in a dialogue with the teen through asking open-ended questions, and really lean on active listening and seeking to learn versus just to fix. So, I often say with parents, if, you get one takeaway from my book, let's let it be this, which is that we want to move away from solutions and fixing to more active listening. So if a teen is saying, everything sucks, I'm really stressed, I don't want to go to school, this is awful, I'm totally overwhelmed, we don't want to say, have you tried meditating? How about going for a walk? Or it's going to be fine, don't worry about it. That, even though that's coming from a very positive place, and again, those are, very helpful solution. So we take a step back, it is helpful to meditate or take a walk or
Sure.
a picture. We really want to help the teen feel that they are being heard and being listened to. And a big part of my work too with the parents is reminding parents that employing that approach is actually in the long run providing a solution by listening to the teen and really seeking to learn more.
So what might that sound like, or how would somebody do that active listening piece if their kid is saying, like, I don't really want to go to school, or everything sucks, and they're, not a danger to themselves. They're not reporting any of those symptoms.
Right.
We're not seeing any substance use or self-harm. So we're saying, like, they're like, everything sucks, or like, no one wants to be friends with me, or whatever it is. How do we engage that conversation with active listening?
Yes. And again, this is where, the intention of my book is to provide very concrete examples for like exactly what you're saying of like, okay, here is a situation. Here is how we respond. These are exact words to use and words also not to use, what we want to move away from. Just, again, some kind of general overview. What I recommend is really a parent leaning on a question and an open-ended question. So steering away from yes or no questions, again, of course, unless it's an emergency, of I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Please share with me. How can I help? How can I support you? Walk me through it. Tell me a little bit more about it. Questions like that, phrases like that, versus the, well, that's not, is that really valid? Or is that true? Or, well, let's just kind of move on, and again, oftentimes the minimizing comes from a really positive place, but we really want to seek to learn more. So again, more examples in the book, but very specific open-ended questions and leaning on certain words and avoiding certain words. And the ones that I recommend leaning on are more of the active listening words versus the fix it and the solution words.
Yeah. So something like what I heard you say is this, or it sounds like this is what's really hard for you right now. Is that what you're saying? Like giving them that part of like, I did hear what you're saying, but also an opportunity for them to correct you if you've misheard.
Yes. Awesome. Exactly.
Okay. So something I often find is talked about in my practice, but just like generally, is how much of anxiety is biological? So is there a genetic part to anxiety, or can we like not have a family history and also have a kid who's anxious?
Yes. And so, the first kind of chunk of my book, really, we go into kind of the factors contributing to anxiety. We do note kind of the genetic factors, and that this is an area that researchers are still exploring. Is it kind of innate? The nurture piece. As a therapist, when I have a client that comes in to see me, or I'm working with a parent, about their teenager, I'm always going to ask questions about the genetic factor here of, do other people in the family have anxiety, depression, other mental illness, substance abuse? I'm never going to say to a teenager, oh, you're anxious because your mom's anxious. No, not at all. But it's something that I'm going to take into account. And I'm going to just be very mindful of. I come from the stance that I don't personally feel that there is one sole reason. Oftentimes people will say to me, well, do you feel that anxiety is because, again, is it biological, or is it, kind of cultural? I personally feel that, maybe for some people it could be more biological, for others it could be more, kind of cultural influences. For some it's both. Again, I don't think it's a one size fits all. And what I really do recommend, I know I'm kind of honing in on this a lot, but, oftentimes parents will get really down on themselves if, let's say, they have their own, levels of anxiety, depression, or, kind of these genetic factors. And oftentimes they'll blame themselves, or they'll feel responsible. And it's really important for parents, as best as they can, not to do that to themselves, and to be passionate, and also recognize that the teen is going to pick up on that too. When we practice more self-compassion, the teen, kind of senses that.
Yeah. Sure. Well, and I think, it doesn't change the fact. So if it's genetic, right, or it's historically been environmental, it doesn't change the fact that we may have somebody who is experiencing anxiety now. So I'm not sure that, I mean, it's a good thing to like keep in mind. And it may be a resource too, to say like, yeah, like I struggled with anxiety when I was younger and I've learned how to manage it. Here are the things that I've done that have helped too. Right. Like, and I know there's that's not what you would say initially. Right. But in a maybe more in-depth conversation, you might say like, would you like to hear how I've worked through it? And they might say like, nope. Don't want to hear any of that.
Totally.
Or they might say, actually, yeah, like, what did you do? And the things that you did may not work. So I think it can be something that we find as a negative if we let it, but it also could be a resource.
Definitely.
And anxiety, I think, it's important for parents to also understand that like anxiety, we need anxiety. Everybody has a level of anxiety because it also keeps us alive. Right. It keeps us from getting in the car with strangers, keeps us from running across the street, keeps us from, doing dangerous things that could hurt us or other people. Right. But sometimes it gets out of that place of being helpful to survive, whereas like a test is not life threatening. Right. So it's safe for us to do that, but it doesn't feel safe. So our body is responding as it's danger, but it's actually something that's safe. That doesn't always make us feel better, but knowing that like we cannot totally eliminate anxiety. And if we did, that would be actually bad. It would be bad for society and ourselves, right?
Totally. No, and 100%, and oftentimes, and it's, again, goes back to how often and to what extent, that, I remind teens and parents that, when we do things that are a little outside of our comfort zone, that's actually where the growth happens. And it's really positive for our self-esteem. And this is, kind of in the sort of second half of my book, I talk about the importance of building self-esteem. And oftentimes that is walking through situations that are very anxiety provoking and for parents, and to be very, very mindful and self-reflective of, okay, is this an opportunity where, maybe it's actually helpful for me to kind of push my teen to get through this? Or is this an opportunity where, okay, I really do benefit from, taking a closer look and making sure that I don't invalidate the teen's experience? But oftentimes, what can be really tricky is, we have these very concerned, loving, caring parents that just have the most beautiful hearts and are so protective over their children. And what winds up happening is that, they tend to kind of rescue or enable a bit too much, which actually does a disservice to the teen. So it's helpful to kind of find that sort of healthy middle ground. And again, I know I keep saying this, but, I really do pose very specific examples of what, kind of enabling rescuing might look like versus, actually helping facilitate independence. I list those in my book. Oftentimes parents, can understand that, kind of conceptually, but then when it's faced with it, it's like, wait, this is actually more confusing. And, I benefit from example. So those are listed in the book. But, it's challenging, and that's why oftentimes I say, it's going to be a bit of a dance. There are going to be times for parents where it's easier, times for parents where it's a little more challenging. It's really important for parents again to just, be patient with themselves as well as their team figuring this out.
Yeah. I mean, okay. Can you give us some examples of what enabling might look like versus when there might be times that we should be pushing them through? Like, how do we decipher without reading the book? Like, what are things like, when is it enabling? When is it something that we should is supportive?
So let's just take, for example, we'll reference that, kind of math test, of, okay, well, is this a time where it's actually positive for my teen to recognize their stress and their overwhelm, and that they can sit through the test and that they can move forward and get through it, that ultimately. And what happens is the next time the teen is anxious, they say, well, I was anxious the last time and I got through it and it was okay, that they can get through it. Oftentimes what we see, and again, like I said, very generalized overview here, but, we'll see parents that immediately will be, first of all, emailing the teenagers' teachers on behalf of the teen, which first of all, just that in itself, a teen is a teenager, not, an elementary school age kid, so, that's something that I really encourage parents to kind of steer away from anyway. But, we'll be emailing the teacher and say, my teen is really struggling and suffer. Can they have an extension, or can they retake the test, or what can they do for extra credit? And again, it's coming from this beautiful, loving place, but what does that teach the teen? It teaches the teen that they can't get through the test on their own. It teaches the teen that the parents will step in for them. And what happens when the teen graduates? What happens if the teen decides to go to college, or the teen joins the workforce right after high school? That kind of behavior doesn't really set them up for success. So, it's, again, a general example here, but, where it's very common for parents to kind of immediately step in to rescue when, it's actually more appropriate to take a step back and say, sweetie, honey, if you really are struggling, let's have a conversation about this. How can you get involved? If you really feel you can't take the test, first of all, the teen needs to be the one that's emailing the teachers, but also even seeing, like, is that really necessary? Is it an emergency situation where we can do that? We're really going to want to take a closer look and just be mindful not to immediately jump to the teen's rescue.
Well, and something you said, like a negative to jumping in that, like with your example, I felt like was really lovely is that if you go to the teen and say, like, what could you do? Like, what do you have control over? That also is not telling the teen, I don't think you can do it. It's saying, I think you can do it. It's empowering, actually, to say, I think you have the skills within you to do this. And it's not saying you can't have supports, that we couldn't ask for help, or that we, you might not lean on me. But if you're jumping in to be like, okay, I'll cancel work tomorrow and I'll stay home and help you study and blah, blah, blah. Like, then it's like, okay, this is an emergency. Like, I can't do this. But if we're saying, like, okay, so here's where we are. Like, what I hear is you're super stressed. You've got a test tomorrow. You're worried you're not going to pass. Talk to me about what's going on. Like, why do you think that that's the case? Like, why do you think you'll fail? Right. And asking those questions to kind of probe deeper to find out what is going on below that surface of, like, maybe they haven't studied. Maybe they don't know how to study. Maybe whatever it is. Right. And I think, in my mind, it's way easier to fail when you're younger than it is as you get older. So, like, might your high schooler fail their test? Yes, they might. Right. But we won't die if we don't fail if we fail our test. Right. But, like, we can help them to solve that. Obviously, that's not our objective. We don't want them to fail. We don't want them to feel bad about it. But I think knowing that, like, something really hard happened and that we can get through it is actually building that resilience.
100%. And this is a really challenging concept, and like I said, I mentioned this in the book. I'm working on my second book to really go into detail about this, because this is, one of the most challenging concepts for parents, because it goes against our natural instinct as parents. The idea of seeing or kind of letting our child suffer or struggle or fail, we'll put that word on it, is so hard. And first of all, that's, I want to put this out there that, like, that's a good thing it's hard for you as a parent. You know what I mean? Like, it shows that you care. And of course, you're compassionate and loving. But it is so essential to let, I use this example a lot of, let your teen scrape their knees and heal. We don't want to let our teen break their knees, to the point where they're in such distress that they can never walk again. But we want to see that they can scrape their knees, metaphorically, and be okay, that they can still move on, and again, like, some of these tweaks that, I go into detail about are also, for the parent to kind of reframe how they see failure. Oftentimes it's actually, this is an opportunity, or this is a learning experience. This is a lesson versus this is a failure.
Yeah. Okay. So what can parents do proactively before anxiety escalates to help build their teens' emotional resilience, to be able to help them? It's probably not in the teen years is when we're starting this, ideally, I'm guessing. Right. But what do you think are the things that might help to reduce the likelihood of anxiety as we adult?
Yes. So, first of all, if a parent, let's say, has a 16, 17-year-old and they're like, oh my gosh, I've lost the opportunity to have a preventative care conversation. It's okay. It's like, you don't have to have a preventative care conversation in order to help your teen, Sure. And with that being said, it's helpful to have a preventative care conversation. And this is something I go into significant depth, with, in my book, because oftentimes parents are very confused about how to facilitate that conversation. And also there can be a lot of fear around that. If I have this kind of conversation, am I going to scare my child, or am I going to freak them out, or am I going to kind of expose them to something that I don't want them to have? And again, it goes back to that really just opening a two-sided dialogue and starting a conversation and letting your teen know by having these conversations that you're a safe person, that you can go to. And again, to lean on that mindful, active listening, seeking to learn versus, okay, this is what anxiety is. These are some stats. These are the facts. Let's pull up some graphs, as to how many people are affected by anxiety. No, we want to talk to the teen about, what they've heard about anxiety. Not just anxiety, but all types of topics, whether it's, substance use, sexuality, sexual health. We want to have those conversations with our teens, and again, very specifics are listed in my book about places to, open up the dialogue, how to open up the dialogue, what to say, what not to say. But generally speaking, what's really important is not to avoid a preventative care conversation out of fear. And to begin this early. Obviously we're going to have a different approach if your child is 6 versus if your child is, 11 or 12. But it is really, really important. And, it can be very empowering as a parent to know that, you're opening the door for that before it begins.
So how might that sound? How could we imagine ourselves opening this door to conversation to say, whether, let's talk about anxiety, just for instance, but it could be about their puberty, their body developing, right? Could be about dating, could be about, it could be about so many different and important topics. But let's say we want to talk to our 10-year-old about anxiety. And it seems like there's been either anxiety, they've had some nervous times, or maybe they saw some friends have some anxiety. How might we start that conversation?
Well, and we're going to want to, again, remember that this is a time to learn, not to fix. So, let's say you're watching something on TV where a character has anxiety or a friend has anxiety. We want to ask questions of, what was that like for you seeing that? Or, and this is kind of more of a yes or no question, but it can kind of lead to some, more open-ended questions of, have you ever had any experiences like that? If so, what's that been like for you? Or, what do you think it would be like to feel that way? Or how would you imagine that you would get through that, and again, not to fix, not to say, okay, if you have that, this is what you do. It's more of opening the door for that. And I remind parents about this all the time, that it's also okay if the conversation is very short. So let's say the preventative care conversation only lasts 1 minute or 2 minutes or 30 seconds. Okay, that's great. We keep revisiting. Obviously, we don't want to force it, if the child is not open to it. But, not to get discouraged if, let's say the child doesn't want to sit down at the dining room table and have a 2-hour conversation about it. Even just kind of a crack in the door is going to be really positive.
Yeah. Well, and I think something that I do in my own parenting journey is the car is a good place. When I'm taking them to and from sports or whatever. And I've been like, hey, has this ever come up? Whatever it is, or what do you know about this topic? Or I know yesterday you were kind of having a hard time. Can we talk about that? Right. So we have this opportunity. It's they know, if I'm dropping off at their school, it's 5 minutes from the time from our house to the practice or whatever it is. And so it's not super long. And so it kind of keeps me short, and also allows them an opportunity to say oh, I'm just kind of, yesterday I was feeling this, and today's been a really great day, and here's what's been going on. And it's oh, I'm so proud to hear that you're having such a great day, and you didn't let yesterday determine how today was going to go. And that's really brave, and whatever you would say. Totally. And being able to also build that resilience. I think sometimes them knowing that we think they're pretty amazing and awesome and resilient, it helps them to feel really amazing and awesome and resilient.
Yes, yes. And it's funny you say that, because actually that's the first example that I list in my book, is for parents to consider having this conversation while they're driving or mixing up their setting where there isn't direct eye contact. And oftentimes parents, because we think of things like adults, understandably, we think, okay, well, that can be too informal or too casual. Again, natural to think that. However, we want to remember we're speaking with a teenager, not, a person in their 40s or 50s or 30s. It's kind of like learning to speak a different language. And oftentimes, even just kind of mixing up the setting of where you're having a conversation can warrant amazing results. And it's, again, it requires some creative thinking, and also remembering, it's okay if it might feel too casual. Like I said, unless, of course, is an emergency situation, it's going to take a different approach. But, a teen will have a different response when, it's presented as, let's have a family meeting at the dining room table where we're sitting across from each other, where we talk about anxiety, versus when we're in the car, when we're walking a pet, or if we're, grabbing a smoothie together after we watch TV. It's gonna have a different approach. It's important for teens to feel that the conversations are coming up organically.
Yeah, even if they're not. Yes. Right. Oftentimes we are totally orchestrating this, yes, right? Totally. Yes. But for them to feel like it's just like a thought that came to your mind, or it doesn't feel so intense, because they think that's like, they don't have to have all the answers. And we want them to feel free to just express what they're experiencing, because I think part of that is what's contributing to where we are with our mental health, is like a lot of kids don't feel like they can talk about how they're feeling or what they're going through. And so it's hard for them. So if they have a person and we're making it so that it's open-ended and that they can say whatever it is, like, yesterday you were the meanest mom ever. Okay, tell me about that. You really felt like I was mean yesterday. I want to hear more about that. Right. Versus taking it as a personal attack. It is, this journey of parenting is so challenging at times, and beautiful and amazing and wonderful and infuriating, right? Like all the things all together. But I think you're right. The conversations where we don't have to have it eye to eye makes it feel like they can just open up and say what they're thinking and feeling.
Definitely. And it's okay for adults, parents, to find that a little bit awkward or unusual. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And, you hit the nail on the head that it is really hard, and this is, I can remind people of this throughout my book too, that, oftentimes the teen is not going to directly express their gratitude to you. They're not going to say, Mom, I so appreciate you thinking creatively and modifying the setting in which we engage in a conversation on anxiety. No, they're not going to say anything, No. They're not going to give you credit or express a gratitude. However, it doesn't mean that they're not noticing it. It doesn't mean that when they're older, they won't look back and remember, that it's essential for, parents to still, maintain hope and optimism, even if they're not verbally hearing gratitude.
Yeah. Well, maybe the gratitude is really just their engagement.
Yeah.
Right.
Definitely.
Like to think that, and sometimes our kids don't engage, right? They're not ready for that conversation on that day, and we get 30 seconds and that's it. And that happens. But I think the more that we're willing to do it, and that we're willing to be uncomfortable, the more likely that they're going to be willing to be uncomfortable. I think they can read that. My mom's really trying here, right? Yeah. Or my dad's really trying, or my grandma really cares. And we're not always going to have the right words. And I think sometimes they understand that. And sometimes they're critical, oh, when you say that, it's so weird. Why do you talk like that? Right. Sometimes we get that feedback and it's like, okay, I understand. Yep. You're right. If I could have asked that question just like you imagined, how would you have responded? Right. So we don't have to take it as a shutdown. We can just be like, okay, let's imagine I didn't say that really egregious thing that you were thinking is so gross and, so old person. Can you answer the question the way that you wish I would have asked it?
Right.
And I find that teens actually answer really well to that. My son does, he's 13. So we're just like newly into the teenage zone, but I find that he is way more open to that when I'm just like, okay, so I'm not sure how to bring this up, but here's something I've been thinking a lot about. Or I was reading this book and they said this. Do you have any thoughts? And sometimes he's like, no.
Of course, which is natural.
And then, right. And then sometimes he's like, yeah, that's weird. And I'm like, oh, tell me what's weird about it. Right. Like, what do you think is so weird? And then just engage in that conversation. So I think sometimes it's not that all the conversations are about anxiety, because if somebody just wanted to talk to me about anxiety all the time, not as a therapist, but as a person out in the world, right? And my husband was like, every day I want to talk to you about anxiety. I'd be like, oh my gosh, new subject, please, right? Like, I'm so over this, but varying it, right? Like bringing up different topics. And I think we can also express like, hey, I feel like on the outside, it's looked like you have been more anxious recently. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, definitely. Again, mindful observation.
Yeah.
And, again, that's different also than someone being judgmental too, of why have you been so anxious, or, why are you acting that way? And again, like I keep saying this, but, for more details, it's really outlined and emphasized in the book, which is that, there are also ways to say this that can elicit a very different response, where it comes across as more curious or inquisitive versus judgmental.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say our teen is having an absolute panic attack or just is not able to calm their anxiety. And we've kind of like tried to like just be curious and mindful and observe and all the things, and they are literally melting down. What tools have you found are helpful to helping teens get out of that like headspace so that they can continue to go forward, or just like take a break from that? Like either way. Yes. Yeah. Totally.
Well, kind of general rule of thumb, what I recommend is for parents to first of all ask the teen, how can I support you? Because often the teen will say, will you just sit with me, or will you just listen to me, or I just need to be alone. And okay, important to respect that. If let's say, there is a parent that's listening and their teen is very receptive to actually kind of more solutions or is looking for more tools, what I do, with my teen clients, and again, we want to be very mindful of, when it's appropriate to give solutions as a parent to a teen that's struggling with anxiety. There are effective tools like grounding, even things like, if a teen is in the middle of a panic attack, obviously breathing exercises together. We'll do grounding techniques where it's like, let's name 5 things that you can hear in the room, 5 things that, you can smell in the room, 5 things that are the color blue in the room, things like that to help them kind of stay grounded and present. And I'm a really big advocate of this piece. And, as a therapist, sometimes this gets quite mixed reactions, that I, and again, list, specifics in my book, but I really like a holistic approach to this, where also it's seeking outlets for the teen that really work for them. So also it might not always look like a teen going to therapy. So, again, going into specifics of how a parent can approach, talking to a teen about starting therapy or getting some type of other support, but for parents to also remember that what might help a teen might not be that, kind of just immediate breathing exercise or those grounding tools. It can be very effective, but for some teens, it's really like, okay, I need to channel this energy, into something that's more active, or let's get the kind of, a sport or some sort of movement therapy or some sort of creative modality. And it's, again, thinking outside the box and thinking maybe like differently than, let's say, they would for themselves. A parent, has to remember like, okay, what might work for me might not work for my teen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I love that idea of getting physically active too, because sometimes even a grounding technique might be throwing a ball to each other, right? Where it's like, or it might be something that can help is like to change the temperature on what's happening. So it might be they're feeling really hot. So it might be putting their hand in some cold water, or it might be splashing water on their face or something like that to kind of like change that channel, right? Jump in the shower. Yes. Right. And it might be that they need warm versus cold. Like what might feel really good to you, or might be like, sometimes I think we have a lot of adult expectations for teens, and they're still kids. Right. And I think there are times where, even as an adult, I'm 41, there are times where I just want to be like my husband to hold me when I'm having a big feeling, right? And that's regulating, that's grounding for me. And so sometimes that part of like sitting next to somebody, or maybe it's like reading something to him. Could I read your favorite book to you when you were a kid? And they might be like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. And then they find that like, that's really grounding of like, oh my gosh, yes. Okay. Right. Of just like changing kind of the channel as to where they are and what is going on. Then we can go back and figure out what we need to. But right now we just need to get to a place of feeling safe and heard and secure. Right. And then we can address whatever the issue is, because that issue can wait. Whatever it is can wait. Even if that means you miss your flight, that can wait. Right. Like we can figure that out after that's actually a problem and we've missed it. Then we'll deal with that part. But like right now, we're just going to work on getting you to a place where you are calm and grounded.
And sometimes even very simple phrases of "I'm here for you, I got your back." Like,
yeah, totally.
I'm going through this with you, you know? And again, respecting though, if a teen also says that they don't want you there, you know, and then that's really hard, you know, and oftentimes it is, you know, like parents can logically, you know, understand, okay, like it's helpful for me to give my child space if they're asking for it, but it's really hard, you know, it's really, really hard to do that. But you know, again,
and you can still check on them, right? You can still check on them to say like, hey, okay, yeah, absolutely. I'll be back in like 10 or 15 minutes to just check on you to make sure you're okay. Right? Like to set a time and then check in and say, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do? They say no. You say, would you like more space? Yes. And so, you know, sometimes they want to talk to their friends about whatever's going on. It may not be us. Yeah.
And that's fine, you know, and again, it's essential that we respect that too as parents, you know, and that can be very hard, you know, there's a bit of kind of grief with that, particularly were once the person that, you know, our child went to confide in, but it is natural development to really lean on their peers during this time. So also, you know, for parents to be, again, very compassionate with themselves, that is painful too. And not to take it personally, even though it can feel very personal. But again, we want to respect what the teen needs without enabling or rescuing, obviously.
Yeah. Which is such a hard balance to get that just right. And I feel like sometimes you know, you, as soon as you feel like an expert in one of your children, then the other one is different. So then you have to like revamp the whole strategy to figure out like, okay, so this kid is experiencing this and I'm going to have to go at it a different way. So like, I think we're growing so much as parents too. Our kids teach us so much about ourselves and about life, and as well as we're teaching them things too.
Definitely. It is, you know, both people working together, you know, on their own journeys at the same time, you know, so very complex.
Yes, totally. Okay. So how can we build our kids, even if they're not having anxiety, but especially if they are, like their tolerance of distress? Because I think a lot of times parents just generally want to swoop in to, it feels uncomfortable for us to have a kid who's feeling uncomfortable. So we want to swoop in to eliminate the distress. What ways do you suggest that parents help their teen or their child to increase their tolerance with distress?
Well, I think, again, we want to really look at the situation, you know, and again, this is where it's, you know, essential for parents to be very self-aware too of, okay, is this actually a situation where my teen is in danger, where it is appropriate for me to jump in? Or is this a situation, you know, obviously in a very loving, compassionate way where the parent can say, you know what, is this my own anxiety that's wanting me to jump in and to intervene and rescue? And again, that's why, like, you know, in the book, I pose these very, you know, specific situations, because there are some that, you know, are very common. And, you know, I see all the time in my private practice where, you know, it's appropriate and healthy for a parent to step away. And then others where it's not, you know, if let's say a teen is very actively reaching out for support, okay, maybe that's a situation where we want to intervene, but we want to, again, be mindful of, are we intervening from a lens of support, or are we rescuing? Are we, and this is where it varies situation to situation, it varies teen to teen, and it varies parent to parent. So this is, also where the self-reflection and the work on the parent comes in, of really being mindful of what's going on within them, of, is this my own fear? Is this an opportunity for me to kind of let go of the reins a little bit, knowing that, okay, yes, my teen might scrape their knees a little bit, but they're not going to break their knees. I'm going back to that example. Or is this a situation where, okay, no, my teen could break their knees and it could be really disastrous and detrimental, and it might sound extreme, but this is where, let's say, teens getting involved in something that's like illegal, or they're doing something could have very serious repercussions on their health, their safety, their future, versus this is a teen, let's say, is really nervous before a test and I want to email the teacher. We're really going to want to differentiate this. And again, it's tricky to differentiate. And oftentimes I will encourage the parent to make sure they have their own form of support, that they have their own therapist, their own counselor to kind of talk through this, and really to identify, is this an opportunity for learning, for growth, for letting the teen kind of flourish on their own, or is this a time for me to intervene?
Sure. And I think something else that, therapist or counselor is great, but also sometimes like having somebody that that is a parent that's already done this stage of life can also be a good person to reflect back to too, because they have some experience with this stage and be like, okay, so this is what's happening. Help me to know, is this my anxiety? Is this my kid's anxiety? Do I intervene? What do you think? Like, my kid, me. How do we handle this? So obviously a fan of doing our own work in therapy, but sometimes it's also just helpful to have a mentor that you feel like, okay, I can go to this person for support because they've had these experiences too.
Yeah, and again, this is where I go back to the kind of, it's not one size fits all too.
Totally.
Any type of support, for the team, but also for the family, for the parent, to look different for everyone, and I mentioned this at the end of my book too, that I'm like, don't just be limited by what I say or what, I write about, this is my perspective. This is what I found is very successful, but read other books too, talk to other people about this, attend parenting workshops, seminars, talk to professionals, talk to friends, join a support group. The more that we know and the more that we're open to learning, the better.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay. So talk to me. Do you have a thought on social media and anxiety, and especially its impact on teens? Do you think there's a correlation or not? Where are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So that, could be a totally separate podcast episode in itself, but I do, I definitely am not going to deny that I feel that there is an overlap there. However, with that being said, and again, referencing what I mentioned earlier, I'm not, someone that's going to say, okay, anxiety, social media is the only reason why teens are anxious. And I take a very strong approach with this, is that, I do not recommend prohibiting teens from going on social media, again, unless it's an emergency or exceptional case. I really recommend parents lean on kind of more of like a harm reduction type model, where what we want to do is actually talk to the teenager about their feelings on social media, about their thoughts on social media, how they can use social media that maybe feels a little more constructive or a little healthier, if we want to say that word, versus saying, okay, you're on your phone all the time, you go on social media and you feel really bad, so therefore you're not allowed on social media. Again, what does that do for the teen? What happens when the teen moves out? What happens when the teen, has free access to social media? And I personally believe that social media is not going anywhere. So it's helpful for us to learn how to use it effectively versus prohibit or restrict.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a balance, because I think, again, like you said, it's not going away. And as parents, we're also modeling, right, the usage of that too. Our teens are looking at us, our kids are looking at us. I think it's interesting that my kids will report like, oh, my teacher never gets on their phone, or my teacher sometimes gets on their phone, or in this class, whatever. Like, they're noticing what people are doing in terms of technology. So we know that our kids are looking to see how different grownups in their environment are engaging with social media or just their phone in general, right? And is that taking away from meaningful relationships, or is it contributing?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And again, this is where it goes back to that kind of, self-reflection of navigating anxieties as parents, also remembering too that, teenagers are also living in very different times and a different world than parents were during their own adolescence.
Sure.
So oftentimes, again, well-meaning, concerned, caring parents will want to say, well, I didn't have anxiety when I was a teenager because there was no technology, like, in terms of cell phones or internet or social media. So let's just get rid of it. But again, what is that? What does that do? And oftentimes that teaches the teen that, we think of them more like a child, which is exactly what we don't want to do here. We want to help the teen feel more like an independent adult here, and also remembering that we're wanting to prepare our teens for adulthood and give them the strategies and tools so that they feel confident going into adulthood.
Sure. And I think, we can still have boundaries, right? To be like, our phones are placed in this space. Like, I think there is a balance. It's not just like you have to give free reign if you give this, that like you have to figure out what works for you and your family and your teenager, and then be able to implement it. I think sometimes as parents too, we set like boundaries or rules and then we don't follow through with them, which makes it more confusing for teens or anybody really to know like this rule or boundary gets imposed sometimes, but not always. So it's helpful to have consistency there too. Okay. So let's say that somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, yes, we definitely have anxiety and my teenager, and this isn't like a dangerous thing, but I feel like this is impacting their relationships. It's impacting their desire to go to school. It's impacting whatever that is, their sporting, their extracurricular things. How do we go about supporting our kids? What are the steps that you recommend to getting them support?
For the teen to get more support outside of the family, you mean?
Yes.
So, and again, this is the third part of my book, going into specifics of exactly what to say and what not to say. General overview here, we want to, once again, collaborate with the teen. We do not want to decide for the teen, again, emergency. Okay, you're going to therapy, you have anxiety. We want to talk to their teen about their feelings of getting extra support. What do you think that would feel like for you? What do you imagine that being like? Are there specifics that sound intriguing to you? Are you open to kind of traditional talk therapy? How do you feel about trying that out? Or are you wanting to maybe explore something different? Do you want to work maybe kind of more in a group or more with a coach or, some sort of holistic modality to start? We want to collaborate with the teen and we want to listen to the teen too. If a teen goes and sees a therapist and are like, I hate this, and the parent says, well, you need the support, so you're going back. Is that really going to get us anywhere? No. We want to, again, work with the teen to decide. We want it to be collaborative. It all goes back to that kind of active listening, mindful, seeking to learn more, and really listening to the teen. And that's the other piece too. This is the next level is, if the teen is not open to getting more support, again, unless it's an emergency, we're going to want to respect that and revisit at a later time. But this is where it's essential for parents to be very mindful of how they could potentially enable or rescue, because often parents will say, well, my teen won't get more support. So that really only leaves me one choice, which is, when they're having anxiety before an exam, I'm going to immediately email their teacher, or I'm going to jump in, or I'm going to do something. Of course, the teen's not going to want to get other support because someone's going to help them at home. Yeah. Someone's going to jump in for them. So, so this is where, it's really tough for parents and for parents to have so much compassion for themselves when they're dealing with a situation like this. And this is where I also really, really encourage parents to make sure they have their own form of support when they're dealing with a resistant teen. But overall, we're really going to want to work with the teen, not for the teen.
Yes, I love that. Thank you, Sophia. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again, Sophia, for that great information. I know if you have a teenager who is struggling with anxiety or you're trying to moderate the addition to anxiety for your teenager, this episode has been helpful. Hopefully, you have taken away several things that you can immediately implement. And also, picking up Sophia's book about calming teenage anxiety would be amazing. With that, I will say thank you so much for your time today. Please like and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and keep the emails coming, please, with future topic suggestions to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day.
Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.